Thanks so much, Tom.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Okay, people often ask me what the biggest challenge is for me in this job, and you would think it's a lot of the things that General Wesley just talked about. It's really talking to a large group after lunch is one of the hardest things I had to do, and then figuring out how to work the remote control. But if we can get through that, I think we'll be good. I think they've already flashed that goofy picture of me up there. One time I had to speak at a large conference, like 3,000 people, and it was a luncheon conference, and they positioned my table right in front of the screen. It was like a 60-foot screen with that picture of me staring at me the entire lunch. And then as I get up there, I realized I was wearing the exact same outfit that I had in the picture. So I try not to wear that one. I'm wearing a different one today, so I'm glad we show that I have somewhat of a wardrobe. Well, thanks so much for having me. I hope you've had an interesting day so far. One of the things I talked about, sort of one of my challenges, and one of them is trying to convey the complexity and the things that we're dealing with. I think General Wesley talked about it a little bit, but what I wanted to do is talk to you about the things that have been on my mind. I've been in the job for about 14 or 15 months now, and it is a incredible job. It's an honor, and it's a privilege every single day, every minute of every day, every second of every minute to be in this position. So I'm really blessed to have the opportunity to be there and to try and make an impact in the short amount of time that we're all in these positions. But what I wanted to talk to you about is I'll walk you through a little technique. I used to teach at the Air Force Academy. I taught there for 3 years. And one of the challenges I had there very early on, I recognized that these cadets have so much information coming at them and so much that they have to do that they get very overloaded and overwhelmed. And so I found it was very difficult at times to capture their attention, kind of like, talking to a large group after lunch. But what I decided to do after that first semester that I was there was to try and figure out a way. What I found is that you had about 10% of the class that was really engaged right off the bat, and they did extremely well in the class. And then you had some at the bottom that weren't really that engaged, clearly overwhelmed, didn't really take time to do the reading assignments. And then sort of a group in the middle that you could it was hard to see which way they were going to go. So what I wanted to do is try to get everybody engaged at the very beginning of the class. And so what I would do is that I started at the beginning of the semester, and I divided every class section into groups of 4 cadets. And their job was, when they walked into the classroom, was to organize their seats into groups of 4. And it was always the same 4 people in each group of 4. And I gave them the first 5 minutes of class to go over the reading assignment for that day. And they were responsible for coming up with 5 to 7 key terms that they felt were the most important things that they could explain through various levels of abstraction down to why is this important, what does it mean for national security, if that was a course or whatever the course what I was teaching at the time. And then I would go around and see how they were doing in that first 5 minutes, and then I would collect all those 5 to 7 key terms, and I'd stick them in my pocket, and then I would lecture for the next 35 minutes or so. And at the end of every class, that last 5 minutes of class, I had a quiz every single day. And that made me the least popular professor at the Air Force Academy, but it was really important because what I would do is I would allow them to take the quiz as a group, but only one person could take the quiz for that group. And the way that was determined was by a roll of the dice. So everyone in the group had a number, and they had that number from the beginning of the semester. And if I rolled a 1, all the 1s took the quiz for the group. If I rolled a 2, the 2s, 3s, 4s, etc. 6 sides on a dice, so if it came up a 5, they got to choose who took the quiz. If it came up a 6, I got to choose who took the quiz. So you can imagine this took that first 5 minutes of the course and made it extremely productive because they wanted to make sure that everyone in the group was engaged with the subject matter and could perform at the highest possible level when they took the quiz. So at the end of the semester, I would take all those terms that they gave me, and all those terms that they gave me essentially were compiled, and I handed them out to them before the exam, a week before the exam. I said, hey, you guys all thought these are the most important things that were in this course, and I can't argue with any of you. You guys spent more accumulated minutes, hours, time discussing these things than I've ever done even studying them. So your exam is going to be based on this. And it changed the way they thought about class and how they thought about learning. So what I thought I'd do today is just walk through with you some of the things, if I were to sit down and think about, the key terms that I've learned over the course of this, or the key things that I'm thinking about that I think are important for me to know over the course of my tenure in this job, I thought those would be interesting things to share with you and then talk to you about what that means for us in the Navy. So the first one, not enough ships. We have a tremendous challenge. The operational requirements that we have now have not waned at all. As General Wesley said, we're in an era of competitiveness with adversaries that we've not seen with this level of capability in a number of years. We still have the issue of dealing with problems in the Middle East, and so we've stretched our people, and we don't have enough ships to basically meet the mission. So that's been a big issue for us. So how do we think about that? We've talked about a 355-ship Navy. Can we really do that? Can we really afford it? What does that mean for the industrial base? How long is it going to take us to get there? And that's obviously a big issue for the Navy, since that's what we do. Second one, antiquated acquisition processes. I was speaking at an industry conference last week in San Diego, and this was about 3,000 people, all either active duty military who were in acquisition or defense contractors. And I said, raise your hand if you don't have confidence in our existing acquisition system to deal with all the challenges that we have that I just had laid out in this graphic that we're building right now. 70 to 80% of the hands went up in the air, that they did not have confidence that the acquisition processes we have that are antiquated were able to address those problems. So that's a big issue for us. We have legacy business operations, the way we do business in the Navy and in the military, that are not at the speed at which we need to be doing things, the way the private sector is doing things. Very, very old. I was in the Pentagon about 12 years ago, focusing on a lot of these issues. I've seen some progress, but not anywhere near the progress that the private sector has made at pacing along over the last decade. Very, very surprised to see that. There were things that we were trying to push a few years ago that we would just call like push-button reports. How much money do we spend today? Where do we spend it? This is something for you who come from corporate life. No, you can push a button and get answers to those kinds of questions. We cannot in the Department of Defense, or in the Department of the Navy, which is staggering for an organization, the Navy, which we have 1 million people. I'm the chief management officer and chief operating officer of an organization with 1 million people. I'm also the CIO because I needed more titles, so I try to grab more. But it's 1 million people. It's over $200 billion a year in budget. And we can't push a button to find out how much do we spend today and what do we spend it on. And that's something we have to fix. Our biggest capital asset is pricing us out of the game right now, and that's the aircraft carrier. When I was a midshipman at the Naval Academy back in the last century, our aircraft carriers, the Nimitz-class carriers, cost between $2 and $3 billion apiece. Our latest Ford-class carrier costs $13 billion apiece. We basically just signed a contract to buy 2 of those at once so that we could save the long lead time costs for material. And that's saving us $4 billion just to do that. That's more than the cost of the carriers were when I was a midshipman a long time ago. So that's a problem. How long can we continue to afford that? Do we need to start thinking about a different way to distribute lethality, or do we still want to concentrate on a big ship? And General Wesley talked about this standoff capability. It's an issue for the Army. It's an issue for troops. It's an issue for our big assets, because our adversaries are figuring out ways to keep us farther and farther away from where we need to be to maintain freedom of navigation of the seas. Our fighter aircraft are now about $100 million. When I was a midshipman, again, probably in the $15 million range. This is the F-35 aircraft. It's the most sophisticated, most incredible aircraft in the world, but it's really, really expensive. And it's very, very complicated. And so getting it to work and getting it to work properly and being available when we need it is going to be a big challenge for us. AI, artificial intelligence. I put a little asterisk there because it also is something that reminds me of some of the IT programs and solutions that we do. It also, for me, it means almost implemented, because we've done a lot of solutions and we never get to that end state, and we never get to the capability that we really wanted to get to through our processes. Russian Revanche Ism, this is what General Wesley talked about. The Russians are becoming a lot more aggressive, and they're coming at us asymmetrically, which is something very different for us, and we have to figure out how we want to address that. We're not comfortable with doing that, but we have to get a lot more comfortable with doing that, because if not, we're going to find ourselves, as the general said, 10 years from now in a strategic scenario that we're not going to like very much. Chinese mercantilism. This is the aggressiveness of the Chinese around the world to expand their influence. They have this One Belt, One Road initiative. They're trying to establish footholds across Asia, across the world. They're trying to buy up port facilities. I'll give you a great analogy to this or story. This summer, I took a trip out to the Pacific Islands, started in Hawaii, went to Kiribati, went to Papua New Guinea, went to Vanuatu, and then to Fiji, and then Micronesia, and then to Guam and back. And the Chinese are everywhere. And my impression, and the story I like to tell, is that on Micronesia, we are building with our civilian construction corps, the CBs. We have 24 of them on Micronesia on the far side of one of the islands building a school. And it's being built very rudimentary. I mean, I love the CBs, but it's being built very rudimentary. Concrete pilings, plywood construction, corrugated steel roof. They're making good relationships with the local population, which is obviously important. Right next door, massive sign, Micronesia Agricultural Center being built by the People's Republic of China for them. Massive facility. So I look at that and I think, are we playing small ball here? And then when I go back to the embassy there, I find out that the Peace Corps, which has been in Micronesia since the Peace Corps was established, just pulled out a year ago. So it makes me wonder what is going on with respect to our national strategy in China and how we plan to counter it. And I think we need to develop a much more whole of government, if not whole of nation, approach to countering this threat. Escalating healthcare costs. This impacts everything we do for our sailors and Marines and their families. The cost of healthcare is escalating. It just drives into our budget. It creates a huge wedge in our budget that crams out all the other things that we have to spend money on. You think $200 billion, that's a lot of money. It is a lot of money. But to maintain a modern force like that we have today, it requires a lot of money. And that investment is being crowded out by the costs of healthcare, so we have to figure out a way to get our arms around that. Educating for uncertainty. We've taken a look over the last year at how we educate our sailors and Marines, our officer corps as well. And we did a study called the Education for Sea Power study, and we came up with a lot of conclusions about what we need to do to readjust and recalculate how we educate our leaders. Because what we can be certain about is that they're going to be dealing in the future with a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and how ready are they for that? I'm completely convinced that our competitive advantage as a nation with our armed forces is 100% dependent on how we develop the minds of our leaders. Because technology and technological advances are really easy to steal, quite frankly. So how do we develop the minds of the people that can deal with that, deal with uncertainty, think about the future, and appropriately address it? And that's really sort of what the Army Futures Command is all about as well. Strain on our forces. Our forces have been out. We've been at war for 17 years, now almost 18 years, and it's a strain on them. We saw a little bit of that with the collisions that we had a couple years ago, where we had crews that were sort of at the edge of their training. They weren't necessarily trained properly, but they had to go and do the mission. And that's one of the great things about the Navy, is that we were always ready to go and fight the mission, and we're never comfortable saying no. So we're trying to build in a culture a little bit that people are more comfortable with saying no, or at least challenging, so that we don't run into a situation where we're putting our people at risk. That translates to strain on military families. We're seeing this now come through in some of the challenges we're having with our public-private housing initiatives. We think in the Navy and Marine Corps we've done a pretty good job there, but there are clearly issues with that, and we have to address those. Cyber-Espionage. This is one of the biggest problems that we have right now. Our adversaries, and some of them we can trace them to nation-state actors, and some of them we can't. That's the thing about cyber, is it's very difficult to determine the source of it. But we do know that they're coming at us through all kinds of creative ways, and they're being, frankly, very, very effective at it. And then, of course, how does this issue of great power competition, something that we haven't experienced in a long time, how does that influence how we develop and maintain our presence on the seas? It's a very complex question for us, and we're grappling with it now. How do you deal with the Chinese building artificial islands and basically saying that, oh, we're doing that to protect the environment, or whatever excuse they use? What is our response to that? It's a very difficult one because it's almost a fait accompli. By the time they're done and they've got military-sized runways on those things, that's now a strategic advantage for them in the middle of the South China Sea. So this is just some graphics to talk you through what we've seen with the Chinese. Since we are talking about great power competition, I just want to put it in context so you can sort of see a visual of what's changed since 1999. This is actually 9 years after I left the Navy. But you can see our forward deployed naval forces, that's in the blue box, were basically about the same as they are now. And you can see where the People's Republic of China was in 1999. You can see the little graphics that represent each one of the little graphics for the airplanes equals 25 fighters. The ship graphic or ship icon is 2 surface combatants. The missiles are 2 surface-to-air missile batteries. And then submarine is 2 submarines. So flash forward 10 years. There's the difference to 2009. And also those areas that they were now in 2009 starting to more frequently send their forces out into and to operate. Prior to that, they were very retrenched, not very active in those areas. Okay, that's 2009. We're now 10 years since then. So here's 2017. And you can see the difference. Our blue box has stayed basically the same. Their red box is expanded substantially. So this gives you a good visual of what they're doing. But I would argue it's the visual. The visual is important, but it's the stuff you can't see that's also critical. Their advances in space technology, their advances in cyber-espionage, all these things that are happening daily that are challenging us, that are basically violations of the law that we just have not come up with a way to address yet. We're working on it, but again, the challenge is, if the Chinese have hired 4,000 people to sit around and hack into our networks, what's going to demotivate them from doing that? And I can't think of anything, frankly, that's going to demotivate from doing it. They can get an indictment from the United States. The chances of them ever traveling to the United States to get arrested is nil. So how do we figure out a way to deal with that challenge is one of the things that we really need to look at. Okay. Another thing I used to do with my students is do a matching thing to give them some good, easy points on their quizzes that we used to do every day. So I've got a list on the left side. These are some important statistics. A list on the right. Let's match them up. So 7.1 million, number 1, 6, 90%. NH4C104, which is ammonium perchlorate, minus 17,000. 1 equals 70%. Plus 2% to minus 3%, 8 years, and minus 70% to 70%. So let me start matching. So 7.1, that's the number of lost manufacturing jobs we've had in the United States in the last 15 years. This is the number of companies in the United States that produce thin wall castings for gearboxes. This is on all the helicopters we build in the Army and the Navy. There's one of those. It's currently in bankruptcy. That's the number of companies that construct and repair ship and submarine propeller shafts. There's one in the United States that's left. There's one company that builds large caliber gun barrels for all the guns that the Army uses, that we use, as well as the Marine Corps. Number 6. The Chinese are the number 1 consumer of machine tools or purchaser of machine tools. We're number 6. And that's a forward-leading indicator, right? That's a capital investment for the future, and you can see where the shift is going. 90% of the printed circuit boards in the world are manufactured in Asia, and half of those are manufactured in China. Ammonium perchlorate is a DoD propellant. There's only one company in the United States that actually produces that anymore. There's 17,000 fewer vendors, prime vendors to the DoD since the year 2000. 17,000. So our industrial base has really taken a hit. The Chinese are the #1 producer of commercial UASs, unmanned aerial systems. 70% of the market are in Asia, and the Chinese are like 70% of that. The change in US productivity over the last 2 years, prior to this, we had a 2% growth, but over the last, since I believe 2004, we're now reducing by 0.3%. All these stats were in the presidential report on the industrial base. And then 8 years, 70%. It takes us 8 years from the beginning of a major weapon system program to get it to initial operating capability. By that time, 70% of the electronics and technology in that system is already obsolete. Okay, so the big question is, what is to be done? This is a great quote from Vladimir Lenin, but also from one of my favorite radio show hosts, a guy named John Batchelor. If you guys ever listen to him, he's really, really good. I give him free endorsements anytime. But he always starts his show with, he throws out a bunch of concepts and then says what is challenges and then what is to be done. So the answer for me is urgent and transformative change, and change to the naval enterprise, change to how we think about things. So the question is, really, so the next logical question you would say is, well, change to what? What does that mean? We all would like to talk about change, but what is that we're looking for at the end of the day? So I think there are lots of characteristics that I think we should be looking at when we define that. So the first one is velocity. We have to start learning to do things faster, buying things faster, making decisions faster, hiring people, training them faster, allowing them to transit between private sector and the military or the military ecosystem. We have to learn to collaborate better. That's across organizational boundaries between the services as well. You know, the general was up here before, and he's talking about great power competition. And I'll say the first thing I learned when I was at the Naval Academy was beat Army. So when I think about great power competition, I used to think about beating Army. But now we have to think about how we have to work with the Army as an integrated force, work with the Air Force, because we can't all do it alone. And that has the broad implications for within the services, but also between industry, the public sector, the public sector, private sector bridges, as well as between various levels in the service. Visibility. We need a lot more transparency to our data. It's very, very difficult to make decisions if you don't have trust in your data and that it can be shared at the proper levels. Adaptability. We need to be able to be adaptable because, as we know, we don't know what the future is going to bring. We know it's going to be defined by uncertainty, so we have to develop forces, systems, structures, capabilities that are adaptable and that can move across that spectrum of threats. Innovation. Innovation is also a great buzzword these days, but innovation is really a process and a way of thinking. And it's not about being reckless in innovating and trying new ideas. Innovation is and many of you here are innovators and have done this with products and understand what I'm talking about. It's a very systematic way to go about looking at new ways of doing things. It's a great book by David McCullough about the Wright brothers, and they talk about how their basic premise was man can fly. That was the out-of-the-box thinking. But how they went about actually figuring out how to fly was extremely systematic and routine, and they tried and they experimented and they wrote everything down and they learned from each iterative process. And we have to, organization that meets these characteristics of change that I'm talking about has to become very, very, very good at that. We have to be humble. We have to recognize the challenges we're facing, the shortcomings we have, and we have to go after those without a sense of arrogance. We have to create an organization that trusts each other. There's trust up and down the layers, because there's a very, very high likelihood that some of our forces might be completely isolated. So what happens then? What happens in those scenarios? Do they know what to do? Do they trust their command? Do they trust their orders? Do they trust the people that are working for them that are left? And that's critical. And then skepticism. And I always get a lot of criticism. I get skepticism about this one. But I talk about skepticism because it is critical. We have to not accept things at face value. And we have to be able to challenge those things. So that's what an organization looks like, sort of defined by those characteristics. There's a great Supreme Court case that Justice Brennan decided back in the 60s or early 70s, in the case on pornography. And he was trying to define what pornography is. And what he said was, it's not so important necessarily that I define what pornography is, it's rather that you know it when you see it. If you start seeing all these characteristics, I think we'll know that when we see it. And to me, these are all characteristics threads of an organization that exhibits agility. And so to me, creating an organization in the Navy and whatever I can do in the next couple of years to get us on the path to greater agility, that's my mission. And that's what I'm pushing for. Here's the true meaning of the word skepticism. True meaning of the word skepticism has nothing to do with doubt, disbelief, or negativity. Skepticism is the process of applying reason and critical thinking to determine validity. It's the process of finding a supported conclusion, not the justification of a preconceived conclusion. We've got a lot of preconceived notions in the Department of Defense, Department of the Navy. We have to start challenging those in order to be able to address the challenges that we're facing in the future. I'm going to close with just a thought. I talk a lot about how we live in a big national security ecosystem. It's not just us in the Navy, it's our contractor base, it's the people in the civilian world who support us, who support our families. It's a broad ecosystem. And one of the things that I talk about a lot is that we have to be able to have a way for people to process and move in and out within that ecosystem. Bring people in from private industry into the government for a few years. Expose them to our challenges. Let us be exposed to their challenges and how they dealt with fixing those things. Because without that, we're going to become extremely insular and we're not going to win. So when I talk about that, I talk about this network, I talk about this ecosystem, the last thing I like to leave people with is to understand who's at the end of that network. And this is a picture of Senior Chief Cryptological Technician Shannon Kent, Senior Chief Petty Officer. When I talk about agility, those are organizational characteristics that I mentioned, but you can't have organizational characteristics that are not reflected by the people. The people's characteristics should be exactly like that. They should be collaborative. They should work quickly. They should be skeptical. They should have humility. All those things I talked about. And Shannon Kent is someone who exemplified those things. She was a superstar in her squadron. She had been at many, many deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, doing very dangerous things. At the same time, she pushed all her team. She was very, very strong physically, but also extremely strong mentally. She was a coach, a mentor, a mom of two, a sister, a daughter, and a wife. And we lost her about a month ago in Syria. So when I try to get people to understand this concept of the network is not something electronic. At the end of that node is a person like Shannon Kent and all the people that she knows and who loved her. And it's our responsibility in the Navy to ensure, as we build this organization of the future, we keep that piece of the network in mind and that we build a Navy and a Marine Corps team that can survive the challenges in order to keep us all safe and free. So thank you very much for your time.